everyone. Welcome to the April 23rd edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. Well, the Kentucky Derby prep season is over. All of that's in the books. We're still a couple of weeks away from the Kentucky Derby, so no preps to discuss this weekend. And there was also no Grade 1 racing to discuss looking back at this past weekend of racing across the country. But there were plenty of lower-level races, a couple of Grade 2 events, a bunch of listed stakes races at a number of venues. And we're going to tour all of those venues to take in the stakes action that we saw, starting at Charlestown, looking at the Charlestown Classic, and ending at Laurel Park, where they had a bunch of stakes races on Saturday. At the end of the podcast, we'll also do a little bit of a preview of the Kentucky Derby, discussing the Pace Projector, which was just released, as well as some of the contenders that seem to be doing well in the week since the preps completed. So I'm David Aragona, TimeformUS analyst, and I'll go ahead and welcome in my co-host, Craig Milkowski. Craig, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Just returned from Dallas. Went to my first ever hockey playoff game last night, so I did a lot of yelling. Hopefully my voice holds up.
Nice. How long of a drive is that for you?
It's just short of 3 hours. It's not too bad. We stayed overnight after, so it's not too bad.
That's the way to do it. Well, we'll dive right in since there's a lot of racing to discuss this weekend. Not really high-level racing, not champion horses, but plenty of horses that were involved in stakes races across the country. And as I mentioned, we'll begin at Charlestown, where they had a bunch of stakes races on the Charlestown Classic undercard. We'll discuss a couple of those, but we'll begin with the major event, the Charlestown Classic, which was won by the local horse, Rune to Love Ya.
Yeah, just a really cool horse. I mean, he's just been destroying anything that got in his path at Charlestown. So it was kind of interesting to see what he could do when stepping up. And, I mean, he handled it well. He rated just off the pace of Diamond King, who we're probably all familiar with by now, and was able to just get hold them all through the stretch. And exciting race. I'm not sure it's worth the $1 million they give away. I would think they'd probably get the same field for half of that, but I'm not the accountant at Charlestown, so I'm just a handicapper. And a good story with that horse. They've had some really cool horses that come out of Charlestown. There was a race named after Russell Road on the card, who was a favorite there, who just won a ton of races. I actually sowed a lot of my horse playing oats at Charlestown growing up in Baltimore. I did a lot of double headers going back and forth from Pimlico to Charlestown or Laurel to Charlestown, so I have a soft spot in my heart for that place.
That's awesome. It is kind of a funny track. I've never been there, but just watching the races from there, they really do tend to play out different from other tracks because it's that 6 furlong, or is it? I believe it's a 6 furlong, or is it a 5 furlong course?
6 furlong.
6 furlongs. The 2-turn races that would normally be run at other tracks are around 3 turns at Charlestown, and the sprints are around 2 turns. And it makes an interesting mix of horses point to these races. And the thing that I always marvel at with the Charlestown Classic is the horses that end up running here from different circuits. I mean, in this year in particular, there were horses that I thought were retired that were running in this race, like Rally Cry, who I didn't even know was still around. The way that this race unfolded, it really did play to the strengths of the front runners. I don't know if jockeys who don't normally ride at Charlestown, they can't time their moves properly or what was going on, but a lot of the horses that were towards the back of the pack, it seemed like they just let the race get away from them. I mean, maybe they didn't have the horse anyway, but coming around the far turn, it was just a 2-horse race. I mean, everybody else was completely out of the race by that point. You can't make up that much ground in the stretch, especially a horse like War Story, who was one of the fancied runners in this race, just was left with way too much ground to make up. And Rune to Love You and Diamond King, they dominated. Diamond King looked like he was empty on the backstretch, but he kept finding more, gamely rallying through the lane to try to get back on terms with Rune to Love You, just couldn't do so. Like you were saying, the winner, it's a cool story. He's won 9 races in a row now, all at Charlestown. I'm not really sure where he goes from here. This was a respectable speed figure for this race, but I agree with you. These are not really Grade 1 level horses.
No, and it was, as a speed figure guy, it was kind of cool to see a horse like Running to Love You, who certainly had the speed figure from his last race to stack up well against a field like that. And that's something I'm always looking out for, because and I'm going to talk about a little bit more, with Laurel later on, is you never quite know. I mean, of course, we do the best we can trying to keep these things on par as horses ship around the country. But it's a difficult job, and especially at a place like Charlestown, which is kind of isolated, not a lot of shipping in and out for the most part. So it's always good to see when the horse, he actually ran better than he had in the past, figure-wise. So just that was my perspective as a speed figure guy.
Yeah, looking at this and comparing it to the buyers, which I often do, I did notice that we rated this horse a little bit higher than the buyers did. And I guess that proved to be the right thing to do because he definitely ran a career best race and handled the horses that shipped in from out of town. He did have that home corn advantage. But this is a pretty nice horse. I don't know if he's going to go on to win other graded stakes races outside of Charlestown. I find that a little bit unlikely. But he got the money today, or on this day. Looking at two other stakes races from the Charlestown Classic undercard, both run at 7 furlongs, one for older horses and one for 3-year-olds. We'll begin with the Russell Road, which was for older horses, won by Clubman from Off the Pace. This race featured a much faster pace than the other race we're going to talk about, and I think that really played into the winner's hands.
Yeah, it did. And, the winner didn't get the best TimeformUS speed figure in here, and that's part of because of the pace, as you mentioned. We have the half mile coded in red. It was quick. It was 1:36. And do take into account that Charlestown, it's a little tougher. These races are around 2 turns. So by the time you hit the half mile at Charlestown, you've already went around 1 turn and are heading into a second. Little shout out to our guys who did the algorithm. Clubman was the top pick in our PPs at 9-1. And he got a real nice setup and was able to close through that short stretch and get up.
Yeah, the TimeformUS Power Picks had a couple of good selections this weekend. We'll get to another one later that I thought was a surprising overlay. Clubman got the right setup in this race. Cool Arrow, who finished second here, really ran well. As you were mentioning, he got the highest TimeformUS speed figure in the field of 125 after setting a pretty fast pace for the distance. I know 23 and 46 flat doesn't seem fast for a 7 furlong event, but at Charlestown, where they go into that tight turn on the clubhouse turn, that really prevents them from running too fast for those opening splits. And Cool Arrow did well to hang on for second in this race. I believe he had won the stakes race for 3-year-olds that's also running this card last year. So he obviously likes Charlestown. A 125, 118, they're respectable numbers. I just don't know if these horses are really going to be top forces in the sprint division. I kind of find that unlikely. And the same goes for the horse that won the Robert Hilton, the 3-year-old, Malpais, who's trained by Joe Sharp, who also sent out Cool Arrow, who was second in the Russell Road. Malpais had a much more favorable pace setup than the horses coming out of the Russell Road.
Yeah, he did. He got a clear lead. He didn't go particularly fast. He only got a 1:11 TimeformUS speed figure, which matched his final time figure from his last win. It was kind of a weird race in that there were 2 horses that were even money in the same field, and Todd Pletcher's Federal Case and Malpais. But on our figures, at least, Malpais looked like the better horse, and he proved it, at least at Charlestown for now.
Yeah, I was a little surprised these horses were the same price. Malpais was coming off that really impressive win that we actually had discussed on a prior podcast in his previous race at Fairgrounds, and he backed that performance up here and actually bettered it. So he's a nice 3-year-old. I don't think he's going to be a major force in a race like the Woody Stevens, but I guess you never know. I don't know where they're going to send him next. They might want to set their sights a little bit lower, but he took advantage of a relatively favorable pace scenario in this race, and that's what you've got to do. I mean, this was a race that offered a decent purse, and he took it down. That was all the racing from Charlestown that I think we want to discuss. There were a bunch of other lower level stakes races, but not really horses that I think we're going to expect to see on the national scene, so we're not going to discuss them in depth. We will move on to Keeneland, where there were some interesting stakes races, but even beyond that, there were a bunch of lower level maiden allowance races that I think we want to discuss. A number of them earned pretty fast speed figures, and there are some up and coming 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds that I think we should highlight. We'll begin with the stakes action, though. The big race on Saturday at Keeneland was the Elkhorn, going 1.5 miles on a turf course that had taken quite a bit of rain. I believe it was rated yielding for this race. And Bigger Picture is a horse that had proven he can handle some giving the ground in the past, and he certainly had no trouble handling it in this Elkhorn.
No, I'm assuming this is the one the other power pick horse you were talking about, who went off at 7-1, which is a kind of hard to explain given his affinity for the turf course. You got a 122 TimeformUS speed figure. I think you got a nice setup. The top 3 were well back early. They were running 5th, 8th, and 7th after the opening half mile. A good 7 lengths back, and Bigger Picture got a little bit of early jump on the other closers, and this was the best this day. I think Red Knight ran okay. Zulu Alpha ran fine, but these are probably just what the race is, grade 2, if that may be grade 3 horses. And you kind of got to take it with a little grain of salt with the yielding course if they come back on firm.
Yeah, Bigger Picture is just a really cool horse. He's been around, it seems like forever. I think he's an 8-year-old gelding now. He's won one grade one race in his career. I think he won the United Nations about 2 years ago, but he just always shows up in these top level races, whether it's the grade one or grade two level. He's always somewhere around at the finish, finishing off his races pretty well. And it's nice to see him get another grade two victory here. But he really did get the right trip, as you were alluding to. He kind of made the last move into a race that was run over very tiring ground with all red color coded pace figures. And that's the last, you do want to be making the last move in that situation. I thought Zulu Alpha, who was the favorite in this race, he was actually a pretty short price at 6-5. He was kind of exposed. He had gotten some very good trips over the winter at Gulfstream Park. And I know he was kind of the leader of this division as far as the marathon grade two level horses go, especially in the Mike Maker barn, because it seems like he has so many of them. And he's a consistent runner who always shows up, but I don't think he's really one that's going to take that next step forward to the grade one level. And I think his limitations were pretty exposed in this race. Red Knight, who you also mentioned, I'm just a fan of this horse. He shows up every single time. He's a New York bred who just seems to keep stepping up in class. He went through all of his New York bred conditions, one after the other. And then he went through his open allowance conditions. He won that 2-mile race at Gulfstream a couple months ago. And now he's back at 1.5 miles here over yielding ground. It doesn't matter the surface, doesn't matter the distance. This horse just always shows up. And in some ways, he might have run the best race because he's lost so much ground making a wide move around the far turn, going even wider than Zulu Alpha, as those two are moving in tandem. And he lost this race by about a half a length. If he keeps improving, maybe he's the one you want out of this race. But I agree, all these horses are going to have to run a bit faster to deal with the top contenders in this division moving forward.
Yeah, and I generally just assume any race for Bigger Picture is a prep for next year's Connolly at Sam Houston, which he seems to have won every time since about 1998. So
yeah, that's his race for sure. That's where he does his best running. Another turf race on Saturday, which was not a stakes bet, but actually earned a TimeformUS speed figure that was 1 point higher than the Elkhorn, was the allowance race that went earlier in the day. I believe is the fourth race on the card, which was won by Nessie from way off the pace. This was not a race that stood up for him whatsoever, but he ran down the field in the stretch, and I think that's why he earned a speed figure that was as high as it is.
Yeah, he got a 123, and you see it's a big gap back to second at 116, despite winning by less than a length in here. That's pretty extreme for our figures. That's about as good a closing kick as you're going to see. He was, he was last, I believe, in a 5-horse field, a good 6.5 lengths back, behind a moderate pace at best. We have some of the fractions coded in blue. Even just visually looking at the fractions of 50.61 half mile, pretty obvious it wasn't quick, and he was still able to run him down. So I was impressed by him. He hadn't run very well his last couple times out, but he seemed to really snap back into form in this one. Maybe it was a yielding course. That's something to keep an eye on. Not sure off the top of my head how he'd run on yielding before, but it's a big number for him.
Yeah, and just looking at the fractions, I mean, we were talking about how slowly they came home in the Elkhorn relative to the final time. And here they went the final eighth of a mile in under 12 seconds, and he still went from nearly last to first in that final eighth. I know it was just a 5-horse field, but this horse was really finishing powerfully at the end of this race. He's a horse that had focused primarily on marathon races in the past. I believe his connections probably could have run him in the Elkhorn, the long shot, wanted to do so. He had been beaten by Zulu Alpha in a couple of races at Gulfstream prior to this. He's gotten some questionable rides, questionable trips in the past. Maybe he's just not the same horse that he once was, or maybe he just wanted to go a little bit shorter because they had run him in so many marathon races. It seemed like the cutback to 1.1 miles really worked for him. I don't know if he's a horse that can possibly step up in a race like the Turf Classic on Derby Day. That's probably getting a little too ambitious right now. But at the lower level graded stakes races, maybe the grade 3 level, maybe he wants to go a little bit shorter. I wouldn't put it past him because he showed the kind of late kick in this race that we really hadn't seen out of him in his longer races.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the distance because he really hadn't run that far and he hadn't won in a while, and he won an allowance race at 1.5 miles. And it seemed like they kind of pigeonholed him after that one as, hey, this guy is a marathon type horse. But he sure looked good on the turn back, and I expect we're going to see him at these shorter distances at least the next few times.
We'll turn the calendar page back to Friday to look at a few races on that card, one of which is the feature race, the Double Dog Dare. The race that drew, I believe, an 8-horse field, but there were some significant scratches. I believe Prize, who was going to be probably the this race came out. I believe she's going to run in the La Troyenne on Derby weekend instead. But we had just a field of 5 after it scratched down. There was a sloppy track. There was a ton of rain at Keeneland Friday and Saturday, as we mentioned. The track for this race was kind of a mess, but it didn't seem to bother Electric Forest at all, making her 5th career start for Chad Brown. She got to the front, set a legitimate pace, but watching the visual, she was doing it pretty easily, and she was able to hold this field at bay through the stretch, going the 2 turns for the first time.
Yeah, I think that was undoubtedly the best race she's ever run. I just want to mention the other scratch. I think it was La Force. It was a horse I was hoping to get to see. She had run behind, I can't believe the name's escaping me.
Bella.
Yeah, unique.
A 2-time champion. Don't forget.
Yeah, that's bad. That's bad. I'll blame lack of sleep and driving. Yeah, Electric Forest ran real well. So 118 Timeform US speed figure, which fits really well at this class. And being it was her first time around 2 turns, I'd expect her to try tougher and see what she can do.
Yeah, Unique Bella is not my favorite 2-time champion in the world. That aside, Electric Forest is she's a funny filly because she's got one of these pedigrees where on the top side, she's bred to run all day, being by Curlin. And on the bottom side, it's just speed, 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 because out of that day music, who in sprint produced McClellan music, who earned that massive Beyer speed figure and just speed figure in general in his debut many years ago and has turned into a decent sire. Apparently, Electric Forest can get 2 turns, which she had showed a ton of speed in her prior races, but she didn't seem to have any trouble handling the mile and 16th in this race. It was the short stretch configuration at Keeneland, and maybe that helped her. It probably also helped her that her main rival, Golden Award, made no attempt to get to the front for whatever reason, and I think that really aided Electric Forest and hurt that filly's chances since this was kind of a merry-go-round race. But the 118 Timeform US speed figure, as you were saying, it's the best race Electric Forest has ever run. And she's a horse that's pretty lightly raced for this division, so I would assume she can go forward from here. Chad Brown has so much firepower in his stable, but among the dirt horses in the fillies and mares, she's probably one of the top ones. So a nice race from her. Not the best race we've seen this weekend, but she's a decent filly.
Yeah, she is. And just, sometimes we emphasize so much on 3-year-old races. I think people forget when we see these horses at 4, they're still getting better. So these horses that are lately raced and maybe had problems or whatever when they were younger and didn't race quite as often or in the top class races, they're always eligible to jump up and improve, especially good hands like this one is.
That's a good point. And speaking of Chad Brown fillies and 3-year-olds, one that doesn't have to improve too much off her debut is Guarana, who won her first start in the 7th race on this Saturday card at Keeneland. From a visual standpoint, this was as impressive a debut as you'll see. She broke out of the gate like a shot, easily established the lead, backed down the pace a little bit around the far turn, and when she got into the stretch, she just kicked it into another gear. It was like she jumped in at the quarter pole against this field. Now, she wasn't facing anything of real quality in this race, but you had to love the way that she did it.
Yeah, and just to put it in perspective, we gave her a 110 Timeform US speed figure with the final time in 113. It was actually knocked down a little bit due to pace. That 110 would put her competitive, and I'm not saying she's a horse that's ready for the Oaks or anything like that, but just from a quality standpoint, figure-wise, she would fit with the Oaks field. Of course, their horses going longer and much more experience, but she obviously is a special filly, and I'm really looking forward to see this one. You don't see many 110s pop first time out by 3-year-old fillies.
No, and I know this filly was working pretty well down at Palm Meadows for Chad Brown. She's an impressive-looking horse. While she is a 3 Chimneys homebred, I believe they actually purchased her dam from the Phippses because her dam is out of the mare Pleasant Home, who was an impressive winner of the Breeders' Cup Distaff back in, I believe, 2001 at Belmont Park. And so this filly's pedigree really can go any way because she's by Ghost Zapper. The Dams family is a little bit turfy, but there are definitely good dirt horses in there like Pleasant Home. And she's certainly bred to handle a stretch out in distance in the future because all of these horses were able to go 2 turns. So Guarana's a pretty exciting filly. It's hard to know what to make of this race from a quality standpoint because, like I was saying, looking through the horses that she was facing in this field, she was a 4 to 5 first-time starter for a reason. There was just nothing of quality in this race, and many of these horses will probably end up in maiden claiming races eventually. But just viewing her as in isolation, this was a very impressive performance. Chad Brown had another good one on Friday at Keeneland, where Royal Charlotte actually also earned a 110 TimeformUS speed figure, winning an allowance race in the third race on that card. This was not a 15-length triumph, but it was still an impressive performance because she was making just her second career start, and she fended off a Wesley Ward filly who seems to have some talent.
Yeah, she sure did. I was going to say was the opposite, and that this was a pretty strong field for a first level allowance race. Bingwa, the Wesley Ward horse that had run fast last time out with a 108, and that was back in October as a 2-year-old. So she's obviously got quite a bit of quality. Even into the South is a decent filly. She's run near 100 TimeformUS speed figures. So I was impressed. It's tough to handle that jump from maiden winner first time out to going right into the allowance, especially when you face some good horses like this. But she was game. She was fast early, and she still had some finish. So, Chad Brown's obviously got a barn full of dirt fillies that are pretty good here. So it'll be interesting to follow.
Yeah, Chad Brown's stable is just incredibly loaded, whether it's dirt or turf at this time of year. I can't really remember a trainer unveiling this many talented horses in maiden allowance races at this time of year. Maybe Todd Pletcher going back a few years, but it's just amazing. It seems like every weekend there's a new Chad Brown star on the scene, or potential star, I should say. I like the way Royal Charlotte did this, just as you were alluding to. Bingwa, off of the stretch, seemed like she had the momentum, and like John Velasquez, a ton of horse under him. She was coming off a layoff, so I guess she had a right to get tired late. But Royal Charlotte really dug in gamely and fought her off. Bingwa, maybe we'll see her on turf in the future because she is a half-sister to Wesley Ward's stable star Bound to Nowhere. So maybe she wants that surface, but she certainly handled the muddy track on this occasion. They're both nice fillies, and the pace of this race, we should also mention, was significantly faster than the pace that Guarana set previously, or rather later on the card. So while they earned the same speed figure, the raw number for this race, the raw final time number for Royal Charlotte, was 7 points lower than the number that Guarana got. They got the same TimeformUS final speed figure because the pace for this race caused the speed figure to be adjusted up, and the speed figure for Guarana was adjusted down a little bit because she set a softer early fractions. But both of these fillies, I think, are really nice. On Saturday, moving back to that card for a second, we saw a maiden race that was, I believe, the last race on the card. Chad Brown, he was unveiling another well-meant firster in this race, Highest Honors, but he couldn't quite catch the eventual winning number, who snuck away at a pretty decent price, and he was an impressive debut as well.
Yeah, 15-1 though, and he ran very well. I think this is another race that is going to turn out loaded. This one I definitely did some work because it just looked like a very fast race with the third and fourth place finishers jumping up quite a bit and several in the field, and on a muddy track. But there really was nothing I could find to knock this race down, and I wound up giving a 109 to winning number. The visual kind of matched. I thought they were two really good horses. They were clear of the rest by a good 3.5 lengths, and just a strong maiden field. People talk about key races. I'm a little bit of a key race guy, but I kind of do it from a figure perspective. I don't really look for wins. I look for horses that come back and run better figures, and I think it's going to be one of them.
I thought it was interesting the difference in between these horses since they were both making their debuts. Winning number broke from the post, whereas Highest Honors broke from the rail, and neither one broke that sharply. They were both off about a half length to a length slowly. It wasn't as big of a deal, though, for winning number because he was in that outside slot, and he could sort of gradually move up into the race while in the clear, whereas Highest Honor had to rate behind horses inside. And at about the 3/16th pole, right when they turned into the stretch, Highest Honor got slammed into the rail. It seemed like it really cost him a little bit of momentum because he was trying to mount a rally at that point, and it gave winning number about a 1.5 to 2 length lead for the final eighth of a mile. I really like the way Highest Honors finished up this race in his first start for Chad Brown. He's a son of Tappet, so he's certainly bred to stretch out in distance, whereas winning number is a son of Speightstown and seems to be all sprint pedigree on both sides of his breeding. So Highest Honors might be the horse that you want out of this race, especially if he's stretching out in distance. But both of these horses showed real ability in their debuts.
Yeah, they did. Shocking. Chad Brown has a horse.
I know. I can't believe it. We'll move away from Chad Brown for a second to discuss another pretty prolific day trainer on Wednesday. And there are a couple of notable 2-year-old performances from the past weekend, and one of them did take place at Keeneland on Wednesday. That was, I guess you say, her name Nyabeth, who earned a 105 Timeformula speed figure in one of those 4.5 furlong races. She was one of two Wesley Ward horses making her debut in this race, but she got bet down to 1-5, so she was clearly well meant, and she was pretty impressive in victory.
Yeah, she was. I'd have to do some research, but I think this is one of the higher 2-year-old figures I've given England as a running girl. Looked professional. She didn't look like a 2-year-old the way she ran. She just went right to the front. The rider was confident. As you said, the tote board kind of gave it away. You never know with these Wesley Wards. You can be pretty sure they're going to win and run 1-2 every time he sends them out almost. But the tote board told you who was going to win, and she backed it up even more so than the tote. She looked much better. Well, it's hard to look much better than 1-5, but she looked every bit the 1-5 she was on the board.
Yeah, all of the horses that he sends out to win their debuts at Keeneland, they look pretty good doing it, and many of them are winning by open lengths. There was something a little bit different about this filly, though, because she just came around that far turn with so much power. And when they got into the stretch, I mean, she closed off her own pretty fast fractions, going the final 16th in a pretty quick split under not serious encouragement. I really liked what I saw from this filly, and she gapped out the field behind her. There were massive margins between the rest of the runners, especially going a 4.5 furlong distance where they don't have that much time to create that separation. So I would imagine it's going to be on to Royal Ascot for a horse like this that was so impressive. And she does have plenty of turf pedigree. She's a half sister to Soldat. So I think it would be no surprise to see her on turf eventually, but this seems like a really good one.
Yeah, and that's what she had, the kind of running line I like to see from a pace figure perspective for these 2-year-olds. Now, granted, we're only comparing these races. They only run this distance for 2-year-olds. But her opening quarter was only a 92 and then a 102 at 4 furlongs and a 105. So as I said, she kind of closed off her own fractions, but that's what you want to see. This horse rated nicely for the short distance. Even as 2-year-olds, I don't want to see him running crazy and running 21s and hanging on late. Those horses win, and but they usually don't have much of a future. This is the kind I want to see that show they have the talent and ability to go longer.
Yeah, I agree with that. And like Wesley Ward sends most of his 2-year-olds to Keeneland for those races and doesn't seem to send the top tier ones to New York for the races that started at Aqueduct in the spring. But we did see him win a maiden race on Friday at Aqueduct, going that same 4.5 furlong distance. It was the first progeny of American Pharaoh to win a race in the U.S. As Maven won his debut against a combination of colts and fillies in a small field at Aqueduct. But this earned another pretty respectable TimeformUS speed figure. Yeah,
it did get 100. Maven beat a long shot. Lebda, I guess is how you say it, who was over 20-1, if memory serves. And they gapped the field. It was well back to third. I think it was well over 10 lengths to the third place horse. So 100, it's respectable for sure. Nobody was fooled here, 2-5 on the winner. I think the surprising part was how close it was at the finish. So these two are probably a couple to watch.
Yeah, Maggie Wolfendale, who's the excellent paddock analyst at NYRA, kind of was a little bit high on Lebda in this race because from a physical standpoint, and you can even see it in the replay, he just seems bigger than the other horses. He really had a size advantage on Maven, and you could see it coming down to the wire as these two are battling together. Both of these horses could be okay, and Maven's another one, kind of like Nyabeth, who has plenty of turf pedigree. While he's by American Pharaoh, I know we already saw American Pharaoh win a race on Europe of his first, I believe his first. And the dam for this was a decent sprinter as well. I wouldn't be surprised to see Maven transition to the turf eventually, and I would assume that's likely to happen with Royal Ascot coming up in just over a month. So both of these horses look pretty good, and I'm sure we'll see Wesley Ward unveil many more in the coming weeks because he always seems to have a stable full of star 2-year-olds. We'll wrap up some stakes action from a number of other circuits. We'll quickly move through Aqueduct, Gulfstream, and Santa Anita, where they all ran a few stakes races that are worth mentioning. There were a number of stakes at Aqueduct, but the one that I think is really worth discussing was the Woodhaven, which was run on Saturday. There was also rain in the New York area, and it created a yielding course for this race. The three main players coming in were 40 under, who had won the Pilgrim last year, and a couple of Todd Pletcher horses, Clint Maroon and Empire of War, who was a stakes winner last year. It just seems like from 2 to Clinton Maroon is the one that's going on because I know he had a favorable pace set up in this race, but he was just utterly dominant in victory.
Yeah, he was. That was an impressive effort. Like you said, we did have the 6 furlong mark coded in blue as a slow pace, but this is what you want to see out of a front runner on turf. Personally, I don't like seeing those red fractions because it just usually doesn't bode well. You got to be able to read on turf, and that's exactly what Clint Maroon did. He had a 104 at the half mile, finished up with a 111 final time. So we gave him a 113 overall. The one thing you could say is he was clear all the way, so maybe look at it with a little skepticism. But this is what you want to see in a runner on turf. One that can really finish off their races. Kind of we talked about with the 2-year-old filly, even though it was on dirt. He really kicked it in through the lane. Pretty good field, and that 113 stacks up pretty well with what we've seen out of 3 turf horses so far this year.
Yeah, the one thing I will say, just to give a little bit of insight into the way the Aqueduct turf courses have been playing, is the outer turf course throughout this meet, especially when the track was a little bit firmer earlier in the week, it did seem to really be giving an advantage to horses that were right down on the rail. And it probably is worth noting that the 2 horses that ran the best races in this Woodhaven were clearly Clinton Maroon and 40 Under, who spent their entire trips to the rail. Came off at a stretch, but he was on the rail around the turns as he was saving ground on the lead. So just take that for whatever it's worth. That might have exaggerated these 2 performances a little bit, but Clinton Maroon is a horse that I've always kind of liked a little bit. I remember seeing some of his workout videos last year at Saratoga as a 2-year-old, and it just seemed like he had a really powerful stride on him. And it took him a little while to run some faster numbers. I know his races at Gulfstream over the winter, he wasn't beating the strongest fields. He wasn't earning the highest speed figures. But I don't know if it was the yield and going or what, or maybe he just likes to run on the lead. He took his game to the next level in this Woodhaven. And I just love the way he finished off this race with that really powerful stride, getting over the going well. And I wouldn't be surprised if he shows up in a race like the American Turf next time. Maybe they'll wait for a race a little bit later on because there are plenty of options for the 3-year-old turf horses at this time of year. But I think Todd Pletcher's got a pretty good one on his hands with Clint Maroon.
Yeah, just one little note about that. I do have the O on this in our TimeformUS codes that we use, our question mark codes, just because it was the only turf race on that course. I'm not sure if there was one on the other course that day. But just so people know, I use that when the speed figure wasn't easy. It doesn't mean I don't use that every single time. Maybe it's the only sprint or the only race on a course. But in this case, it wasn't an easy speed figure day. So for that one race, so that's why you'll see that O from time to time.
Yeah, I was actually meant to ask about that. That's a good point to make because that was the only turf race on either course because there was some rain in the area and they only kept the one stakes race on. So maybe it's not the speed figure you can have utmost confidence in, but you can't deny that this horse was a dominant winner just watching the race visually. Moving down to Gulfstream Park, there were a couple of minor 7-furlong stakes races for the 3-year-olds, one for the fillies, the Game Face, and one for the colts, the Roar. The one run earlier on the Gulfstream card was the Game Face for the fillies. That was won by a bit of both, who kind of seems like the female version of Maximum Security for Jason Service. She was coming out of some cheaper races, had won a bunch of races in a row, and she stepped up to stakes company here and handled it pretty easily, getting a career best 114 TimeformUS speed figure.
Yeah, I was going to say we met a couple fillies from Chad Brown running ends and then popped the 114 at Gulfstream. I thought the competition was as good as we saw in that once race. But there's no doubt she's fast. She ran very well. She got set a fast pace. The opening half mile and the quarter mile are both coded in red, and she still was able to win easily. The fact nobody was able to make up any ground says a little bit about her quality and that of those behind her, that maybe they're just not quite as good. As the speed figure maker, it's kind of an interesting topic with Service because at this point I almost just have to ignore the projections I use from his horses and look at the rest of the field because his run out of their skin so often. If I put a lot of weight on his, I think I'd be underrating a lot of races. So, well, I do, of course, look at the time the winner run when he sends out these horses that just run off way better than they have in the past, which seems to happen a lot with him. I kind of focus on the other horses as much as the winner or even more.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that you can't always predict because with service, it's not always first off the claim and it's not always off a trainer switch. Sometimes it happens over time, but he will get horses to significantly improve on their prior form. Now, to be fair, this is a young filly and maybe she's just getting better. This was only her fifth career start, but this was a significant advancement in her speed figure trajectory. I do want to note one thing that really seemed to help her in this race is she completely cut off her main rival at the start. You can actually see it pretty well with the angle that they use at Gulfstream, that kind of not really quite a head on, but just to the side, going the 7 furlong distance. And I don't know how much control jockeys have at the start, but Paco Lopez just veered to the right and cut off Karama with Nick Juarez on, and it really compromised that filly's chances. And she was the 7-5 second choice in this race. She ran pretty well to be second, all things considered, but she was never going to get on even terms with a bit of both after that kind of start. So that might have helped the winner a little bit and allowed her to run a faster speed figure than she otherwise would have been able to do. Gladiator King, who has become a favorite of ours. He won the other division, the Colt division, I should say, of the 7 furlong stakes races at Gulfstream Park on Saturday. It was his 13th lifetime start. He's now won 5 races. They should just focus on sprints with him. I know they've tried a bunch of different spots in the past, but this horse is kind of overcoming his connections by continuing to win these races.
Yeah, he's kind of become my favorite horse out there, and it certainly is because of the connections who probably wasted several spots with him. But as a betting guy, I mean, I don't know how this guy – it was one thing that we got a nice price on him last time, but this time, I mean, it just makes no sense. I didn't understand this one at all, but sometimes you just got to take what the public gives you, and this horse is just a cool, tough game horse. He looked like he was going to get run down late to me watching the race, but he just dug in and was able to hang on by a nose. And he's just one of my favorites. I hope I get to see him in person. And it's one I don't really pay attention to the connection. It's just the animal that you fall in love with. And he's just a really cool dude.
Yeah, he probably liked getting a little bit of a break because I think they had actually entered him to run in a race at Keeneland in the interim between this start and his last one, and he had to be scratched at the gate that day.
Yep.
Yeah, so he had kind of an unplanned layoff coming into this race. Maybe that helped him a little bit. But 7 furlongs, probably a bit far for this horse moving forward. I think he's really more of a 6 or a 5.5 furlong kind of horse. But he was able to get it done over this field at Gulfstream Park, not really the top level sprinters, and he's just in any race. He's going for a fast wherever he shows. Sticking with the sprinters, we'll discuss one race from Santa Anita. And actually, this was the TimeformUS power pick that I was talking about that I was a little bit surprised about because Sistron won this race at, I believe he was 6-1. And just looking through this field, he was the only horse with any speed whatsoever. The TimeformUS Pace Projector rightly pointed that out because it was a situation favoring horses on under the lead. And he just got to the front and they never had a chance to catch him.
No, this was actually the race I chose, despite it being a 5-horse field. It looked so obvious to me. I used this for my out of the gate segment for our pace projector. The only real surprise in here to me was the price. I mean, he was 5-2 on the morning line. I have no idea what happened with the bettors who, for some unknown reason, keep betting Kantaka, who's a decent enough horse, but he's not. He doesn't deserve the reputation that he has with bettors. I guess the one big question mark with Sistrom was turf. He's been running on turf mostly, but I even showed it in our segment. When you look back through his past performances, he had run fine on dirt in the past. He had mixed it in with some turf and going back and forth between the surfaces. So, every now and then, this is what you got to look for as a bettor. You got to find these areas where the public just makes a mistake. And this wasn't just a long shot getting a nice trip. I mean, he destroyed the field. This race was over probably 100 yards into it. It never looked like it was going to be a race.
Yeah, I think bettors sometimes get afraid of horses that don't win that often, and it had been over 2 years since Sistron's last win, and I know that can sometimes worry people, but Victor Espinoza, who was on him in this race, just really never gave him a chance to lose the race because he put him right on the front from the start. He had a significant advantage around the far turn. There was just no catching him. He's a funny horse because, well, I don't want to redboard or anything. This is not a race that I really looked at ahead of time, but he had focused on turf for the majority of his career, but all of his prior dirt efforts against top company had come in two-turn races. And he's clearly a better sprinter. And this is really the first time he had a legitimate chance to run in a dirt sprint now that he's a mature horse. And he clearly responded well to it. He had a much better late kick than he had shown in his recent turf races. So I wouldn't be surprised if they keep him on dirt from here on out, because this was a nice effort. I do want to temper a little bit of that enthusiasm for this horse by saying, while this was a grade 2 sprint race, this was not the cream of the crop out in Southern California or really anywhere in the country in terms of the top level sprinters. Dr. Door is really more of a routing type, an all out blitz. He's not really a grade stakes kind of horse. And as you were mentioning, Kantaka, I just don't think he's really gone on since his 3-year-old year. So he was beating a suspect field in this race for a grade 2 level event, but he certainly ran a respectable speed figure to beat them.
Yeah, 120 is definitely a little far for a grade 2. So, I don't think he's ready for Roy H or anything like that. My only other comment on this is you mentioned Victor Espinoza. And I really liked what he did with a horse with lone speed, and that he actually let him run. He put him out there and used his advantage, as opposed to sometimes these guys that get a tactical advantage like that, they'll choke the horse back and just kind of let everybody keep up with them and then try to outkick him in the lane. And me as a bettor, I'd much prefer to see this kind of ride on a speed horse than when we get at other times where, maybe he chokes that opening quarter back to a 23, but he keeps everybody in the race.
I completely agree with that. Speed horses, they want to run fast, and I think they run their best races when they're allowed to use that speed in the early portion of the race, because sometimes it doesn't work out that they can produce that speed in the stretch after you rein them in so much for the early part of the race. So I think he rode this horse to maximum effect. We'll stick with the sprinters as we move on to our final stop on this podcast at Laurel Park. There were a bunch of stakes races on their Saturday card, and we'll go through all 5 of the major ones in chronological order, starting with the Frank Whiteley. Sistron got a 120 for a grade 2 race. I think this was a listed stakes race, but it was, I believe, the highest speed figure that was given out last weekend, as Lockheed got the best of Louisfield. These two seem to keep trading decisions in these races at Laurel and Maryland, but it was Lockheed's turn this time, and he ran one of his best races.
Yeah, he's a good horse. He's been running really well in Maryland. He runs a lot of 120s. I mentioned this briefly earlier. These are the ones I want to talk about. This was the one I wanted to mention, was the Laurel race, where these sprinters in Maryland always seem to run speed figures. And I'm not saying the speed figures aren't accurate, but for whatever reason, I talked about the Charlestown horses. They don't seem to ship. You won't find a lot of these horses doing well. Other horses at Laurel do just fine, running at different distances, shipping around the East Coast. But for some reason, these stakes sprinters, they always seem to run fast there, but I've learned to temper my enthusiasm a little bit when it comes to the window. I can't figure it out why it is that way, but it's just been my experience that I avoid these when they ship. But they definitely run good there, and they keep facing each other over and over again for the most part. And it's just some solid horses I'd love to own. Just I'm a little leery of them as a bettor.
Yeah, I was pondering this question myself because I was looking back through the past performances of both of these runners, because they really have turned into nice sprinters. I know we were talking about Louisfield's race in the Not for Love when that race was run a few weeks ago on this podcast, and he earned a 124 TimeformUS speed figure that day, which really puts him at that graded stakes level. And I was looking back at their performances last year when they tried to ship. I believe one of them or both of them went to Pimlico for that race on Preakness weekend, and they were not running quite as fast prior to that race as they are now. It seems like both of these horses have taken a step forward in the past year, and I'd be interested to see them try grade 2, grade 3 level types out of town once again, because it does seem like both of these horses are just at the top of their games right now.
Yeah, and they are. They're getting to that age. I think they're 5 and 6 years old, where horses really should be at their peak. We don't often see that, with the top horses, because they're usually retired by now or they move on, but these two are fast. I'm not saying they can't win shipping, and certainly would take a shot. I just wanted to make the point. I'm really keeping a close eye on this and trying to figure out what's going on. When these two horses, I was more of a general point than these specific ones. It's been for a couple years with these Laurel ones where they just don't seem to back up the 6 furlong races. So something I'm sure we'll talk about again in the future, and I'll be keeping an eye on.
Yeah, that's interesting. The next stakes race we'll discuss at Laurel Park from Saturday was the King T Leatherbury, which was a 5.5 furlong turf sprint run over a turf course that seemed to be rock hard. We got some rain in other areas across the country on Saturday, but I don't think they got any rain at Laurel because this was a pretty fast final time and fast fractions throughout the race. I know Dave Robin, who was calling the race, seemed a little bit surprised at how fast the half-mile fraction went, almost not believing it. But Dirty got the right trip from off the pace, closing down this field. Really nice performance, though, by the runner-up, Completed Pass, who got the highest Timeformula speed figure of anybody in this race. He somehow survived those insane early fractions to be second here.
Yeah, that's a race I'm going to have to go back in time it to believe those fractions. I haven't had a chance to do it yet. It didn't really affect the figure making, believe it or not. I mean, I think the between fractions were fine. The increments, maybe the start was off a little bit. Laurel does use that new GPS system, which it's not the beam. I think it's pretty good, but it's not perfect. So I do want to time this one. Laurel puts their races on YouTube, so I'll have to check where the rail was. If it's out, then it'll probably be an impossible task, and I'll just move on. But the figures were good. I think Dirty ran a 117, which is pretty good for a listed stake like this. I think Completed Pass, who was beating the neck in second, we gave him a better figure, and I think he probably did run a little better race. He was battling for the lead through those fast fractions. Whether you believe the actual numbers or not, I don't think there's any doubt the pace was fast. The winner came from 8th. The third place horse came from 11th in a 5.5 furlong race. So Completed Pass is the one I'd want to see out of this one, but solid effort from the top two.
Yeah, I agree with that. Completed Pass ran a pretty amazing race because the winner came from about 9 lengths back. The third place finisher came from 11 lengths back. They were really closing from pretty far off the pace, going a 5.5 furlong distance. And Completed Pass was actually making his turf debut in this race, and it's kind of a funny horse. He doesn't have any turf pedigree that I could find, but he obviously moved forward on this surface, and I would imagine they'll keep him there for the time being because this was a breakout performance in his turf debut after running some faster speed figures on the dirt in his prior races. Dirty's just a solid horse. I know he had gotten beaten by World of Trouble in a couple of races for restricted 3-year-olds last year in the summer at Belmont and Saratoga. But it seems like he's moving in the right direction now as a 4-year-old, and he's versatile enough to be up on the pace. He can come from farther back, so he's always going to be dangerous, and we'll see if he can make the transition to some of the tougher graded stakes that we'll see in the future. Wrapping up the sprinters with the fillies on the dirt, we saw Miss Locust Point, who's a reliable runner around the Maryland circuit. She took down the Prima Netta. She was the even money favorite in this race, and she had to work pretty hard to win, but I think our speed figures reveal that she was actually much the best.
Yeah, she was much the best. She's kind of the queen of these Maryland races, especially I think this is one of the ones for Maryland breds. She's won, I believe, 9 races, more than half her lifetime starts. And she's kind of a bully. When she gets a field over a barrel like this one, she beats up on them. This one was closer than what we normally get, but as you mentioned, that was because of the pace. She was challenged early, opened up a big lead, and was able to hold on late. But, she's a horse when she steps up and tries like the Fritchie and races like that, she finds the waters a little bit tougher. But when you put her in against horses that she's just faster than, she's really tough to beat. And she gets bet every time. Cool little Maryland bred. That's where I grew up. I grew up close to the part of Baltimore called Locust Point. So I always smile a little bit where I see her, and I root for her. But, she is what she is. She's probably a listed stakes filly. She's not going to win many graded stakes, but she's tough.
Yeah, that's a cool story. I agree with that. Karen and Starwood Silver, who were second and third, they really did launch runs from pretty far back in this race. At the first call, they were actually last and second to last in the early going, and they were able to get up for second and third. And all of the horses that were chasing Miss Locust Point on the lead were massive long shots in this race, 29-1, 52-1. So it's a credit to her that she was able to hold on as well as she did after dealing with those horses on the front end. She's obviously a horse with some talent, like you were saying, but I do think she has a ceiling. But nice to see her run so well in this race and winning, despite the margin only being a nose. The final 2 stakes races we'll discuss are stretching out in distance, one on the turf, one on the dirt. The The Dahlia on the turf for the fillies and mares was won by Secret Message, who I was surprised that she was 9-2 in this race. This isn't a race that I really had handicapped beforehand, but I remember Secret Message from last year running in some of the restricted 3-year-old races at the graded stakes level and running pretty well in a race like the Sands Point. And she was dismissed at 9-2 in this race in the face of La Moneda, who took all the money, the New York bred filly, who seems pretty reliable. She always finishes at the exacta. La Moneda had no real excuse in this race. She got there at the 8th pole, had the lead coming to the wire, and just got run down by Secret Message.
Yeah, Secret Message is an interesting point from a handicapping perspective, I think, because it was her first race as a 4-year-old. And sometimes I think people forget they put a little too much value in speed figures. And, this horse hadn't run in a good 6 months. She was coming back. I'm sure she was bigger and stronger. And particularly in turf, where speed figures are dictated so much by a short part of the race. If you bet her based on what she ran as a 3-year-old, she looked like she had no chance. And maybe that was part of the 9-2. But I wasn't surprised that she was able to win this race. I mean, she was running against much classier fillies. I think she was in against Rushing Fall last year. She ran in some of the graded stakes at Keeneland last year. She ran in the Sands Point. I think she ran second that day. So, I mean, she was a classier filly. So if you over-rely on speed figures, you're not going to come up with this horse. But I think this was a case where they probably weren't indicative of her ability. I do want to mention this is also a case where the fractions were all in blue, and she was able to come from behind, as was the runner-up. She was 7th early, over 7 lengths behind. And on these turf races, that's what I want to see. I want to see these horses that can finish, especially into the blue fractions. And we do give that boost in our speed figures. We do give it on turf for the red fractions, but not as much as we do on dirt. But if I have my choice, I'm going to prefer this kind of horse over a horse that sets fast pace and quits every time.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing you want to see. And it was nice to witness Secret Message returning with such a positive effort in her 4-year-old debut. The final race from Laurel that we'll discuss is the one that I think got the most attention, and I think it serves as a good transition into our final topic on this podcast, which will be some of the Derby contenders, but one horse who's not going to be targeting the Kentucky Derby, who had a lot of people buzzing on Saturday, was Always Mining, who won the Federico Tessio. He earned a respectable speed figure. I don't want to suggest that he ran a slow race, but he was beating a field of suspect quality at best. I mean, just looking through the horses that were in this race, Always Mining was, I believe he was, 1-20? I mean, he was as short as he was for a reason on the tote board, because the other horses just had never run speed figures that put them nearly in the same league as this runner. And I know he rated for the first time, and all of that's positive, but I'll be somewhat surprised if this horse is a major player in the Triple Crown events moving forward.
Yeah, I saw somebody mention how fast he closed in the fastest of the Derby preps. And my first thought was, well, this isn't a Derby prep. I mean, it doesn't even give any points out. But, probably just a slip, a Triple Crown prep, whatever. I mean, he should be able to close fast. They walked up front. He sat off the pace, which is always a good thing. Any horse who can rate, can show some versatility, because we already know he's fast. That's a quality sign. But he still only ran a 1:14. I'm sure we'll be told he could run faster because he won so easily. And sometimes they can, but I just don't get the impression that this is really a top-class stakes horse. I think he's good. I mean, I just don't think he's a grade 1 horse. I guess we're going to get to find out in the Preakness. I'm sure he'll take some money. He'll be considered the local horse. There's always a horse that seems to campaign in Maryland that takes some money on Derby Day or on Preakness Day, and some of them run well, but I'm just not feeling it with this guy. Usually what I want to see in these horses that are running in lower classes when they step up is faster figures. I'm not really going to depend on a horse to suddenly run faster when they face better competition.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too down on him because he's an admirable horse. He's won at a variety of distances. He shows up every time. He was winning by large margins. It's just, you really do have to pay attention to what these horses are beating, and Try for Gold and Bazzini. I mean, they're combined, their best prior TimeformUS speed figure had been a 97. That's just not even stakes level, really, at any level for these 3-year-olds. And it's no surprise that Always Mining trounced them. He's got to do a little bit better. Maybe he can. But like you, I'm a little skeptical about it, especially being able to do it in a race as tough as the Preakness. And I've seen plenty of people saying that he's the horse that could stop a Triple Crown attempt, perhaps, or he'll be a major foe for whoever wins the Derby, given how wide open the Derby picture is. But I think you actually have to take a look at some of these Derby horses, and many of them are running faster races and are doing it against much tougher competition. So while we're a little bit confused about who is the leader of that division, that doesn't mean that we just have to turn around and go searching for a new face. It's very likely that many of those Derby horses, 10 of them or more, are faster horses than Always Mining. Maybe he'll step up in the future, but I think you do have to rely a little bit on the data when you're analyzing horses like this.
Yeah, and I'm not knocking the horse at all. I mean, he's obviously cool. He's winning left and right. I forget how many he's won in a row, 6 or 7. I'm just looking as a bettor jumping into a race like the Preakness. I'm going to look elsewhere. I would want to see a horse that's run faster, that's faced better competition, faced challenges during the race, and we just haven't seen that from him.
So sticking with the 3-year-olds, we'll wrap up the podcast today just by having a little tiny discussion. We don't want to go too in depth because the race hasn't been drawn yet, and there's still a lot of uncertainty out there. But we do want to touch upon the Kentucky Derby because it's the topic that we've discussed the most on this podcast over the past few months. And looking at the TimeformUS data for the race, we did on Twitter post the TimeformUS Pace Projector for the Kentucky Derby. That's not going to significantly change after post positions are drawn. I know some people are concerned about that. Post position is not something to really factor into the Pace Projector, especially since the Kentucky Derby is starting on a long straightaway. I don't think that matters that much. But we are going to be talking about the Derby way more in depth in the future as part of our TimeformUS handicapping package, and we'll talk about the Pace Projector much more. But we'll just give a cursory glance at what the Pace Projector is trying to tell us and what kind of trips some horses might get in the Kentucky Derby. And I'm looking at it now, and Vekoma and Omaha Beach are the 2 horses that have the highest TimeformUS early pace ratings and are predicted to be in front. But I don't think this is a race that necessarily features a confirmed frontrunner.
No, I agree. And I think it's kind of up in the air. I write an article every year about the Derby and how I think the Pace Projector is going to play. And even though I designed this thing, I talk about the ones I think that might be off. Always Dreaming was a good point a couple years ago. He was shown in the middle of the pack, and I was the first one to come out and say he's not going to be in the middle of the pack. I think he's going to be much more forwardly placed, and I even picked him to win the race that year. This thing is just using the data. There's no opinions going in there. So I've gotten a lot of questions about like maximum security, game winner. The fact is maximum security is shown back because he's run really slowly early in his races for the most part from a pace figure perspective. Yes, he's been up front, and we do consider running style, but the pace has been so slow that's where he's shown. It doesn't mean he can't run faster. This thing is going to be wrong. Hopefully not as often as it's right, but it's hard when you're trying to guess every horse. But the goal of the Pace Projector is just to kind of get people to look at the race and give them a starting point. And we want people to disagree with it and try to form their own opinions. I mean, if we all looked at this and said, yeah, that's right, that's how the race is going to play out, and we already knew it, it wouldn't really serve its purpose. I think the way, if you watch Andy Serling, which I know you do, and you work with him at times, the way he'll use the Pace Projector, it's just as that rough starting point and then to try to pick it apart. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. But the main point I have is it's just based on the data. It's based on how fast they've ran, where they like to be positioned in the race. And in a field as big as this one, 20 horses, somebody has to be 10th, somebody has to be 12th. They can't stack up 20 wide around the first turn. So I don't really have any problem with who's shown in the front here. They've been the fastest. They both like to be up front. And keep in mind, this is also after a half mile. People sometimes think that it's in a race this long. People sometimes think it's after the first 200 yards or the first quarter mile. And that's not the case. We're looking a little farther down the track after the horses sort themselves out. And, I'm curious, what do you think some of the horses are who maybe are mispositioned in here? I would tend to agree with people. I'm sure Maximum Security will try to be closer up. He's the one that sticks out. But unlike Always Dreaming, I'm not sure he's fast enough to do it.
Yeah, I'll just elaborate on what you were saying a little bit because I agree with everything that you were just laying out there about how to use the Pace Projector. Something that I think people I don't want to say misunderstand, but so, something that I think people are missing a little bit with the pace projector is that it's telling you how fast horses have run in their prior races. And there's a difference between that and necessarily how horses are going to run today. And one of the reasons that we find and we say up front that the pace projector is more useful in sprint races is because the nature of sprint racing is horses that are speed types that come out of the gate and they run as fast as they can for as far as they can. That's not the case in route races, and it's much more at the liberty of the jockeys and the connections and the tactics that they decide to use. So a horse like Maximum Security might be capable of running sprint fractions, but in the Florida Derby and many of his prior races, because of the situations that he was encountering, they decided to rein him in the early going. They decided not to run those types of fractions that he might be capable of running, especially in the Florida Derby, which I think is a race that is factored heavily into this pace projector. If you laid that race on top of a race like the Wood Memorial, Maximum Security probably would have been 5 or 6 lengths off the pace in that race if they used the same tactics. Now, you'll say they probably wouldn't have used the same tactics in the Wood Memorial. It's just the pace projector can't make that leap by itself. We're not going to insert that subjective judgment into the pace projector. It's just telling you what the data says, and there is useful information to be gleaned from what the data is trying to say. And we'll just stick with Maximum Security for a second. We're saying that Maximum Security, in a route race in particular, has never had to deal with a really fast pace. And that certainly wasn't the case in the Florida Derby. And he, to be positioned where people think he'll be, might have to run a lot faster than he's accustomed to. And that could potentially have a real impact on his performance and prevent him from running the kind of race that he did in the Florida Derby. That's a decision for the handicappers to make. But I think the pace projector is just kind of putting that in your face. That's something that you should be aware of when you're assessing Maximum Security. And with a horse like, let's say, Vekoma, who's predicted to be on the lead, Vekoma maybe isn't really a front runner. His connections probably don't want him on the lead. He's really more of a stalking type, and that's how he's been most successful. But Vekoma is a horse who's been involved in some fast-paced situations. He was chasing that pace in the Fountain of Youth that was extremely fast. He was running fast fractions in some one-turn races as a 2-year-old. So you know that Vekoma has a high cruising speed and is comfortable with a variety of pace situations. So even though he's predicted to be on the lead, he's probably not going to be negatively effective if he's just off the pace, because you know he has that high cruising speed, and the pace projector highlights that. And then finally, with a horse like Game Winner, it's difficult for the horses in the middle of the pack, because I know Game Winner is predicted to be back in, 14th or 15th place early. Game Winner is a horse that is pretty versatile. And this is a Derby that has a lot of horses that have similar running styles. A lot of them have been stalking the pace in their Derby preps or coming from just off the pace. And because Game Winner has shown the ability, like he did in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, to come from further back in the pack, his early pace ratings are going to be a little bit lower, just slightly lower than some other horses who have stalking running styles. And when you're looking at the early pace ratings of all of these horses in the TimeformUS PPs, it's pretty remarkable how closely grouped a number of them are. And we don't show horses being, as Craig was saying, 20 wide across the track. We limit the pace projector to having horses 3 wide. But if we allow horses to be even 4 wide or 5 wide, you would see the middle of this pack more closely grouped. We just don't want to make that conjecture that horses are necessarily going to be extremely wide into the first turn, because that's opening up a whole other conversation that we're not trying to have with the pace projector. But just the point we're making with Game Winner is he might be slightly slower, or he might be slightly more versatile than a lot of other horses who are predicted to be in that clump of runners towards the middle of the pack.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you make. For example, I mean, we show Maximum Security, who's the 11 horse on our pace projector currently, sitting in 6th, and he has a 103 early pace rating to Game Winner's 93, which is only really 2 lengths. We use about 5 points per length on the pace projector. But if you look at it visually, he's several back, and it's just because it's going to be a bunch field. And in the Kentucky Derby, that's going to happen. Horses are going to get shuffled back. It may not necessarily be Game Winner. It may be. We don't know. And post position will have some influence, especially in the middle of this pack. I don't know exactly how the algorithm works, but when it comes to sorting out when we only go 3 wide, if you have 5 or 6 horses that are very closely rated, the ones who get the outside post are going to be pushed back a little bit. So it will affect that bit a little, somewhat. The 2 leaders are going to stay the same, I would assume. providing that the field doesn't change. But just to kind of look at it, when I use the pace projector, do I care if it shows a horse 10th or 12th or 14th? Not really. I'm looking to see who's going to be involved in the pace. And I really like how you described it. I'm probably going to listen to this again and steal some of your comments when people ask questions on Twitter and via email, which I'm always happy to answer. You guys all know you can reach me there. If you listen to this podcast long enough, you know I'm usually happy to answer it if I have the time. And I will always answer questions about the pace projector and try to explain it. And as I've said, I don't always agree with it, but it's presenting the data objectively. We want you to add the subjectivity, and that's a part I'm going to steal from you, David.
Well, I just frame it in that way because I hear a lot of people say quite often, I disagree with the pace projector. And what you're really saying when you throw out that statement is, I disagree with the data, because all the pace projector is representing is what the data of the pace figures is in the horse's prior races. It's not somebody pulling the strings behind the scenes. It's not Craig taking the 11 Chicklin, moving it from second place to sixth place. That's not how it works. And I think sometimes people assume that is how it works. So I hope it's enlightening for people to hear about how this actually is arrived at and how it can still be useful, even if you might not expect the race to unfold in that manner. We don't have to go ahead and talk about Derby predictions at this point because it's still a couple of weeks out from the race, almost 2 weeks out. Maybe on the podcast next week, we can do a little bit more of a deep dive on some of the contenders, because I do have some thoughts about how the preps played out. And we can look back at a few of those, because I think next week, once again, ahead of the Kentucky Derby, is going to be a week that's pretty light in terms of top level graded stakes races. So maybe we can do a deep dive on the contenders then. But I did want to make some time this week to talk about the pace projector a little more. And I hope that discussion was enlightening for some people. So Craig, be ready with those Derby opinions next week.
Will be. We'll do.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to the podcast this week. As always, you can listen to us on drf.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Daily Racing Form, and we are the TimeformUS Pacecast. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you again with another episode next week.